Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Hello, I'm Thomas Taylor, a member of the Department of History at Wittenberg University. This is one of a series of taped conversations with Clark Countyans recalling their experiences during the Second World War. The Reverend John J. Morrett, a retired Episcopal priest who was decorated for bravery as an Army officer in the Pacific, talked with us at the home of his nephew during Thanksgiving weekend 2001. John was born in Springfield in 1916. As a young man, he was active in the Boy Scouts and at Christ Episcopal Church on East High Street. He graduated from Ohio State in 1939 and began studying for the ministry that same year. After the war, he continued his seminary studies, was ordained, and went on to a distinguished career in the church, serving 2 years in Shanghai, 21 years in Honolulu, and 11 years in Columbus, Ohio. John's first call was to the ministry, but in 1941 his studies were interrupted by another call to accept an officer's commission in the United States Army. He was among those stationed in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked U.S. forces on December 7, 1941. During the months that followed, the Japanese, under Admiral Yamamoto, launched an all-out offensive in the Pacific, believing that Japan's only chance against the much larger U.S. was to win and to win early. The British surrendered Singapore in February and in March surrendered Burma. In the Philippines, General MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. But undersupplied and outgunned, the Filipino and U.S. forces gradually lost ground, and John was among the 70,000 that surrendered to the Japanese in the spring. Japan had never signed the Geneva Convention that protects POWs. Japanese military culture did not respect the concept of surrender. And the Japanese military was unprepared to take responsibility for so many POWs so rapidly. After their initial capture, these U.S. and Filipino soldiers were moved northward in a desperate 60-mile march that came to be known as the Bataan Death March. Of the 12,000 U.S. servicemen, 600 to 700 died, and at least 10 times that many Filipino soldiers died as well. Thousands more died in camp after the march, many of diseases related to malnutrition. Others simply were murdered by their captors. And that was only the beginning. Around 5,000 U.S. servicemen would die in Japanese POW camps before the end of the war. Second Lieutenant John Morrett survived the Battle of Bataan and the Bataan Death March to spend over 2 years in 4 different POW camps. In those camps, his 2 callings, as a soldier and as a priest, became one calling, and John learned to see Japanese men as both enemies and as potential friends. In September 1944, John was aboard the Shinyo Maru, a Japanese ship loaded with 750 U.S. servicemen. That ship was torpedoed, and over 660 of those POWs lost their lives. John and 81 others survived, were protected by guerrilla forces, and eventually were rescued by the U.S. Navy. John himself was decorated for his work that day, and he spent Christmas of 1944 at home with his family in Springfield.
Dean Angus Dunn, in the middle of my second year, called me to his office and said to me, "I hear that you have a commission in the military." And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you know, you're halfway through your training. Don't you think it'd be a good idea to resign since there's so much war going on in the world?" And I said, "No, I didn't think so." And he said, "Well, would you be willing to ask for a deferment?" And I said, "Well, I'd be willing to write to the Dayton Military Headquarters for reserve officers and see if they wouldn't allow for a deferment, which I did do. And within a week, I got an answer to my letter, which simply stated that I was half through training for the ministry and I'd like a deferment. The reply was no deferments are being granted at this time. So I accepted that. And on a little trip to a mission with a friend of mine, Charles Braidwood, one Sunday evening, we were discussing this, and he happened to be a pacifist. And he said, well, I've got some contacts in Washington, and I can see that you'll not be called. And I said, no, don't do that. I mean, I accepted the commission, and I'm willing to fight for my country if necessary. So anyhow, I finished the second year in June, and Braidwood, soon after I got home, wrote me a letter and said he'd made arrangements for me not to be called. And this distressed me very much, and I also received in about the same mailing a letter from Fort Hays, Columbus, Ohio, asking for reserve officers to volunteer to go to Hawaii, the Philippine Islands, Alaska, and the Panama Canal Zone. And I said to myself, well, I'll let them know I'm available. So I checked the little box for the Hawaiian Islands and sent the reply letter right away to Fort Hays, Columbus. And within several days, I had a telegram there at home stating that I was to report for active duty at Fort Hays with, I think, the following Monday, which I did do, and so I was into it. Well, at first, I was a supply officer for Battery C, the 88th Field Artillery. And then that changed. We had, at that time, every battery had 4 officers, but one after another were taken away, and it left me as an executive officer and a CO for the battery. My battery commander was bumped up to the headquarters battery, and another officer was sent with the Philippine Army, so it left us with just the 2 officers in the battery. As soon as we arrived, all the military dependents in June of 41 had been sent home, which was an indication that the War Department was fearful that something was going to happen. And there was a good deal of talk about an invasion from Japan. And I would say within a month's time, we had orders to be in the field with our trucks and guns. Every day of the week, and on Saturdays we cleaned the guns and repaired trucks. And we had Sunday off. And we also had orders that no one was to go to Manila for longer than just one day, and which might be on a Sunday. So we were very much on the alert at that time. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rang, and it was somebody from the communication shack saying that Pearl Harbor had been bombed and we were at war with Japan. So I immediately roused out the American MPs that were asleep and said that they were to take over the posts that the Philippine scouts were manning around Stotzenburg. And then I went over to our battery headquarters, and at that point I was told that I was no longer with Battery C, but I was to develop an ammunition supply train for the battalion because we didn't have any. Supply train provided the ammunition and the food supplies for the whole battalion. So they were commandeering trucks off the road and bringing them into a big truck park, and I went down there and began to organize for a ammunition supply train. I might say that that day when the war broke out at 12 noon, 2 flights of medium bombers came over and bombed Clark Field and simply absolutely destroyed Clark Field, which was adjacent to Fort Stotzenburg. But my main job was to get this going, and the military police were bringing in civilian trucks off the roads. So I lined up, I suppose, about 10 or 12 big trucks, and then the next day going over to the bodegas and loading them up with ammunition and supplies. And the next day, why, the whole battalion moved out and went north toward Tarlac, which is sort of north of Manila. And the war was on. I think there was a certain amount of orderliness and a certain amount of confusion. Orderliness in the sense that we had well-trained units. The scouts had been in the Army for quite a number of years, and they were, as I say, well-trained. But there was other confusion, like the fact that we didn't have an ammunition supply train for the battalion, and had to pull all these trucks off the road and load up with ammunition and supplies and go north as quickly as possible. And with, again, the fact that the Japanese control the air, and they were over every day, bombing, strafing. And we were uncertain about exactly what to do. There had been 2 different war plans set up. One was to go into guerrilla warfare and disperse around the islands, and the other was to go into Bataan and set up a defense line there until help could come to us. But of course, as we know, it never came. So we were our gun batteries were firing within a week. The Japanese landed at Lingayen Gulf and began coming south through the center part of Luzon. Everybody was uncertain as to how things were, because we had a lot of Filipino constabulary and Philippine Army troops that were very untrained. Many of them had been just recently conscripted, and we were not sure how they were going to hold. And so we began to establish holding lines, one after another. But the Japanese were seasoned troops and very aggressive, and there was a lot of combat going on and a lot of firing as far as our guns are concerned to keep them off our backs.